Hello, I'm Dean Carianis, and welcome to History Author Showtime. The Dummy is episode 98 of The Twilight Zone. It aired on May 4th, 1962, so that's 60 years ago, almost exactly. It's been one of the most enduring from the series, becoming a piece of pop culture history itself. We'll go behind the scenes to see what brought this classic to life, beyond the nitpicking you can read for yourselves at places like IMDb. So pour a glass of bourbon, pop yourself some popcorn, and find your seat. It's time to roll tape. This look back features one of my all-time favorite guests on the History Author Show, or anywhere else I've worked in media. And I have worked in television, worked in news, in radio, so I'm really paying Anne Serling a high compliment. She's the author of As I Knew Him, My Dad Rod Serling. You can find that interview, which, by the way, is by far the most popular of the hundreds there, in our archives. Anne's father is not just one of my favorite writers and really a mentor of mine, even though I never met him, but he's one of my favorite human beings. Just so creative, so morally strong, just a really good guy, and so prolific. He wrote this episode of The Twilight Zone called The Dummy, as he did 92 of the 156 episodes during the anthology's run.
156 episodes, dude. Huh. Bulk of the series. Oh. Not exactly a lightweight.
No.
Cliff Robertson plays the main character, Jerry Etherson, and also voices the wooden villain of the piece. And I have to tell you that while I'm reading that, I realize Jerry Etherson is spelled Ether-son. Good writers always have attention to the names they give their characters. And here's one right there. Ether and Son. Ether-son. Think about the ether. Something ephemeral out there. It disappeared, floated into the ether. And son. Son of the ether. That's a little play on words from Rod Serling. Something hidden in the character. Pretty cool. Even after 60 years, you could still find new things in a great piece of writing. The dummy Willie's malevolence stuck with me all these years after I first watched the episode as a kid back in the 1970s. And I still remember when I spotted Willie's face on the Twilight Zone pinball game that debuted at the Jersey Shore back in 1993. It was a Philip J. Fry moment for sure.
Shut up and take my money.
And let me tell you, those were quarters well spent as you tried again and again to get the machine to make all the little references to the Twilight Zone. Thanks to Stuart T. Stanyard's book, Dimensions Behind the Twilight Zone, a backstage tribute to television's groundbreaking series, we get some insights into the dummy. Cliff Robertson enjoyed his time working on the show. Robertson had praise for director Abner Bilberman, remarking that he and Mr. Serling always listened to their actors. Since both men had gone to Antioch College, it helped create a bond between them from the very start. Robertson called Mr. Serling a delight to work with, and he had the highest regard for him. He said of Serling, quote, he liked actors that had come from New York. One of the reasons, I suspect, was because he felt they were not just a pretty face. And let me tell you, that is something that really takes me out of a movie. I find it's difficult sometimes to tell actors apart because they feel today as if they've all been stamped off an assembly line. Same hairstyle, same scrubbly beard, same mustache, same manners of speaking. You don't have guys with really distinctive looks like Cliff Robertson, or like, say, Lee Van Cleef and Lee Marvin. The same name, but when they appeared together in Twilight Zone's 1961 episode, The Grave, it was impossible to confuse their characters. And the same was the case with the many famous faces who traveled to that other dimension over the series' run. So it was never a challenge to suspend your disbelief. Those actors really knew their craft, and they would become the characters. And because I never felt as if I was watching actors reading lines and going through the motions, trying to hit their marks, I wondered what the experience was like on the set. Groundwork was laid for this episode, the very first time that Cliff Robertson and Rod Serling spoke on the phone. Robertson said he liked my work, and I sure loved his. For the book, Stanyard asked Robertson, what were your first impressions of Rod Serling? Robertson responded, all my impressions, first and always, of Rod Serling were of admiration. First of all, he was such a sweetheart of a guy, a gentleman. You didn't know how such a really relaxed, laid-back type of guy like that could think of the things he thought of and be able to discipline himself to put it down. He was quite a decent man. He loved to sit there and write by his pool. That was his big thing. He had a world-class tan, and he was happy with that. He was a nice-looking guy. Indeed, the real Rod Serling was a doting father, animal lover, outdoorsman, and World War II veteran, not to mention a force for justice, too. He left our world an emptier place when he passed away at just 50 years old on June 28, 1975. Fortunately, his work endures, fulfilling his wish that he'd be remembered as a writer. That reminds me of the epitaph Thomas Jefferson wrote for himself, which didn't even mention his 2 terms as President of the United States or his 1 term as Vice President. Instead, Jefferson chose 3 other accomplishments: author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. As for the episode's main star, he was a little bit wooden. It was Revelo Petty who designed Willie, a prop that looks just lifelike enough to be disturbing. 50 years ago, Japanese roboticist Masahiro Mori defined the unease we get when an artificial life form gets closer to human but doesn't quite make it. If they look not at all like us, we think they're cute. If they look just like us, well, it's just a person. But that spot where they get close and not close enough, and they're disturbing and weird and creepy, Mori called the Uncanny Valley, which reminds me of an opening line from the Twilight Zone narration.
It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Willie coming to life certainly was much closer to the pit of a man's fears. The talent of the puppet maker, the actor, the writer, and the director all came together to produce this enduring, spooky final product. But while the rest of us see Willie and feel a chill down our spines, afraid to take our eyes off of him because he may move when we're not looking, Anne Serling had a very different recollection of the prop, which she shared in our interview about her book, As I Knew Him, My Dad Rod Serling. In this clip, Anne recounts about as unique a childhood memory as you can get. One of my favorite anecdotes here in As I Knew Him, speaking of you as a little girl, helping listeners to picture you as that daughter of this iconic figure, you discuss Willie, the creepy, perhaps demonically possessed ventriloquist dummy in that Twilight Zone episode, starring Cliff Robertson as the man who's supposedly putting words in the mouth of Willie. And I know as a child myself, they used to play those on WPIX, which you probably remember all the time. It would come on, I guess, after Star Trek. So if you were still up in time to hear that music and pull the covers up over your face, and it was the Willie episode, it really freaked you out. And yet you have this great story about playing with Willie.
Yeah, he didn't often bring props home, but he brought the dummy home. And of course, neither my sister or I had seen this episode. So what we saw was this doll that my father would animate and make alive, and it would sit on my father's lap. And we had him sit at the dinner table with us, and then my sister and I fought about who could sleep with him at night, and then, my dad had to take him back, and we were so sad that Willie had to go. And then years later, I saw the episode and realized, oh my God, here's this malevolent creature who then actually becomes a ventriloquist, and it was terrifying. So the Willie that stayed those couple days in our house was not
no incidents.
Not who he appeared to be, apparently.
One of the most evil, infamous props in all of television. He brings it home for his little daughters to play with. And it occurs to me, we were just talking about him being a practical joker. You're fortunate that he didn't bring home the actor who plays the dummy at the end come to life and said, oh, look, here's Willie. I brought him to life. Because it seems like maybe something he might have done, depending on your age, if it would have freaked you out or not. But bringing home this dummy and saying, here, go play with it. And then the way you write it in the book, saying, then we see it on TV and say, what were you thinking? How could you give us that? So you're probably the only person who watches that episode and has any fond memories of it about Willie.
Well, I think after watching the episode, those were somewhat erased. So
yeah, you found out what he was really all about.
Yeah.
That's just a wonderful insight and just such a personal story. I love to think of Rod Serling at home, and I love to play some small part in dispelling this notion that he was some tortured, dark, twisted soul. And that was one of Anne Serling's goals when she wrote her memoir. Again, it's As I Knew Him, my Dad Rod Serling. Mr. Serling himself remarked, "Apparently on screen, I look tall, ageless, and damned close to omniscient, delivering jeopardy-laden warnings through gritted teeth. But when people see me on the street, they say, by God, this kid's 5'5", he's got a broken nose, and looks about as foreboding as a bank teller on a lunch break." Well, I hope he knew what Cliff Robertson said about him. He thought he was a good-looking guy. And I do too. I certainly don't think that he was a dark, twisted soul. He would have been a great guy to meet with, and also a great mentor, a great teacher for many of his students. As for Willie, he worked out so well that Rod Serling brought him back to the Twilight Zone for the 1964 episode, Caesar and Me. After that, the prop resided in a Connecticut private collection for decades, but now lives because Willie is quite alive to me, as he was to young Anne and her sister, in David Copperfield's International Museum and Library of the Conjuring Arts in Las Vegas. He's roommates with Cliff Robertson's dummy effigy, which appears at the end of this episode after that supernatural O. Henry twist. Robertson also visited the other dimension twice. His first appearance on the Twilight Zone was 1961's 100 Yards Over the Rim. In that shoot, he convinced Rod Serling to let his character wear that memorable stovepipe hat, rather than the anachronistic Stetson the director preferred. It's another example of Rod Serling listening to his actors and collaborating to get it just right. Rod Serling said he appreciated an actor that took his work so seriously that he did his research and homework on the real history of the period. Robertson had ancestors who had traveled the West on those wagon trains, exactly like his character, Christian Horn, who plays a settler from the 1800s. Robertson said, quote, "They came in those wagons with everything they had, and it wasn't much, and the clothes they had were the clothes they had on their back. And that was a trigger for me, because Christian had gone over the mountains. He'd gone a ways in the desert, and the people are tired." Well, we're not tired at all of the Twilight Zone, so for more on the man behind so many great moments of television history, please do check out my interview with Anne Serling and pick up her memoir, As I Knew Him, my Dad Rod Serling. For more time travel adventures, you can also check out my History Author Show interviews, where I always try to dig into how Hollywood's visions of yesterday match up to the truth. Well, it's time to get some fresh ice and refill my bourbon. Thanks for watching History Author Showtime. Now go read a book.